All right. Well, just got one new poem for you today, but a little bit of introduction to that. Now's the time our culture says to make some kind of New Year's resolution. I don't know how those have worked out for you, but um, and if they do work for you, great. They never quite worked out for me. And what I learned from the Trappist, coming up here 40 years ago now to study with my Trappist mentor was they took vows. And vows are not goals that can be measured. Vows are aspirational. They're more like the horizon towards which you're going. They're more like the North Star to which you're guiding by. So they're guides. And I want to suggest some aspirational vows for the year. And I'll use the three Trappist vows, and we'll actually be working with these off and on during this period. The vows are tricky because you have to translate them a little bit. The vow of stability is one. It's the first vow. And technically, on the surface, that means that monks don't hop from monastery to monastery. Once you sign up, you're in this thing. You could leave the monastery, but there's no. Merton wanted to become a Carthusian and all these other things, and the abbot kept saying no. You're vowing to stay stable and keep your seat. And on a deeper level, it's a vow of showing up. We're going to talk today. The poem today is going to talk about how this contemplative life, not just formal contemplation, but a contemplative life, is an invitation to a conversation with the divine. It's an invitation to a conversation. You're invited, as Hafez says, you're invited to meet a friend. No one can resist the divine invitation. So that narrows down your choices to just two. You can come to God dressed for dancing, or be carried on a stretcher to God's board, sometimes literally. Okay, so we're here. The first thing is you sort of take a vow. Well, I'm going to show up. God always shows up. I'm absent. We're absent. We don't show up in any moment. You're showing up for this. Some of you, as many times as I've shown up, and I've shown up almost every time. There's something to that aspiration to show up, not just here for heart to heart, not just on Sundays, but just almost in every moment to show up, you see. And there's a dialogue going on. The divine it's a tricky dialogue there because the second vow gets to, how the dialogue happens. The second vow is on the surface, obedience. The monks take a vow of obedience, but that's really from the Latin, which it points to the ear, ab audiens, of a vow of deep listening, audience, audio. And so they take a vow of deep listening, because if you're going to have a conversation with the divine, who his favorite language is silence, you're going to have to learn how to listen deeper than we do in normal life, you see. And so to take a vow of deep listening, to have aspiration that you're going to listen deeper, not just in formal prayer or contemplation or meditation that you do, but, every moment. And to listen with the ear of the heart is the first line of the Benedictine vow that the Trappist took. To learn how to listen deeply. Yeah, so that's a second aspiration. So showing up, which some of you really are good about. It's a remarkable community we're building here. People show up, even when they don't feel like it. Some of you didn't feel like it, but you showed up anyway today. That's the mark of a monk, monk in training. And then to listen deeply. Now you're listening to a talk. We'll segue into where we're listening in silence. And then the final portion is we'll listen in a kind of dialogical with the whole community. We'll listen to a lot of voices there. This is all dialogue, you see, it's all dialogue. And so vow of deep listening, that starts at the very beginning and goes all the way through. Now, the third one is interesting. The third one is maybe the hardest one to get. It's called, in Latin, it's called the vow of conversio morum, which really means a conversion of manners, but it really means, and this gets to why we're sort of a recovery group, if not 12 steps, we're all in recovery here. We're trying to recover the oneness we came out of. We came out of oneness into this kind of split kind of life, duality, me and you, us and them, subject, object. We come into that world. That's what humans do. But how do we get back into this unity? And the conversio morum, the conversion of manners, means part of the process, and this is the long-term, subtlest part of it. Part of the process is you pay attention to what gets in the way of the first two vows. And these are patterns, long. These are patterns of behavior that we had even in the womb, of how we don't show up, how we don't listen. What stands in the way of those two things? That's the third vow. I'm going to pay attention and I'm going to work with those things. Like if you are in a formal 12-step like the AA or something, you realize, alcohol leads to death, literally, but it also leads to death of relationships, death of all these, showing up for people, the ability to listen deeply. And so, but it may not be out for me. It was not alcohol, it was work, workaholic, recovering workaholic, recovering egoholic. We all got me in the center of everything, Boy, if you don't think that blocks having a relationship with the world, think again. And so we're going to look at these things, and we're going to focus on it quite a bit in the Saturday the 14th morning intensive. So 3 things: showing up, for the sacred in all kinds of situations. So look at the new year and just say, well, how are some ways I can show up? You're showing up here. That's beautiful. But every day, see, maybe it's to do your own silent meditation or contemplation. Maybe it's to something else to think about is, maybe you can always be reading a little bit from a book of somebody who's gone before you in this. Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Rumi, the Buddha, the Tao Te Ching. If anything, we're an interspiritual group. That's one of the things Merton brought. Merton brought me to Kentucky, and it's still why I'm reading Merton all the time. Is he busted out of this parochial Catholic thing, which I was born into in the 50s. We didn't have. He brought contemplation out of the monastery and back into life, real life. He said, yeah, we all can have this. It's just not monks and nuns and priests, etc. And he was going against the grain at that point, and a lot of people didn't like that. But interestingly enough, the current Pope, bless him, when he talked to he had this visit to the United States and talked to Congress, he talked about 4 Americans that he thought were, like the most remarkable Americans: Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton. Of all the Americans to pick out, he picked out those 4. Great. And Lincoln wasn't just a great politician. He was a man who listened deeply, as did all of those, and they were all interested in justice. They were all interested in peace. So that's quite interesting. Yeah. So to be reading a book by one of those 4, read the life of Lincoln. Dorothy Day. Those aren't just the only 4, but those are 4 Americans. I'm always reading a little bit of Merton. Keep them in my reading room, always by my side. So if you're not reading, that's called Lectio Divina in the Christian tradition, spiritual reading, to hear the voice of somebody who's been these are like the Daniel Boone's, the Magellans of the spiritual thing. They've made this deal. They've walked this road. And, it's a little bit like 31 flavors. Mert might not be your flavor. Maybe it's Rumi, or maybe it's the Hindu mystics, the Upanishads. Doesn't matter. So you find your flavors, but to always be in touch with some ice cream, real ice cream, not frozen yogurt, whatever else you're reading. Some people say, well, I'm too busy to read. I said, you're too busy. That's like a smoke alarm there. If you're too busy to read a few words of some enlightened person who's made this walk, well, then you're too busy. So maybe add some spiritual reading, even if the poetry is great because it's short. You can have enough time to read a poem by Rumi, or Emily Dickinson. Everybody can read a poem in the morning. That's why poetry really fits in. Read a Kurt Vonnegut novel. It's these little bite-sized chapters. He knew who he was writing for. There's a lot of ways you can bring spiritual reading in through this new year if you're not particularly onto that now. See, take a walk. Take a walk. I went out this morning walking in the fog, walking past Ron's house. 9 bows to Ron, living down at the Hermitage, but it was nice to walk in the fog. When Jesus said the great commandment was to love the divine with your whole heart and soul and love your neighbor as yourself, well, then the Pharisees who were there, the lawyers were saying, well, who is my neighbor? And then, he went into this deal with the Good Samaritan, the most hated person is your neighbor. But really, the better question is, who isn't your neighbor? And for me, the trees, the wind, the birds, that's what Francis got into it's amazing that Francis in the West and Rumi in Turkey, they were both like simpatico. They were talking about that everybody's your neighbor, everything's your neighbor. My first Zen master, Suzuki Roshi, said, you should be prepared to bow to everything, even dust bunnies. These are your brothers and sisters. Okay. So, but to get into nature is something that is an opportunity to have a dialogue. If you're listening, if you're thinking of walking or listening to a podcast and you walk, that's another deal. But if you're just walking through nature, the Japanese call it bathing in the forest. You go out and you bathe in it. Well, then there's another dialogue going on. Next Sunday, we'll be actually featuring the Epiphany and what it really means to live in a world of epiphany, where you have these deep dialogues with the soil, the water, the clouds, the fog. Yeah, it's good for you. We live in boxes, in them, get in boxes on wheels and go to other boxes. And there's days where you don't even go outside in some cities. I lived in Houston for 10 years. That was the way we lived because it's too damn hot most of the time. Air-conditioned box, the air-conditioned box on wheels to an air-conditioned, we got to get out of that. So that's another thing. Spend more time in nature. See, so there's a lot of possibilities if you start looking for them. And then, communicate with people like we're doing now. Merton wrote 15,000 letters in his life. No email, 15,000 letters. And the amazing thing about his community, he was writing tons of letters when he was in the Hermitage, where he had the whole day. It was nothing for him to write 15 or 20 letters in a day on his manual typewriter. Somebody who watched him, guy's name was Jim Forrest. He was up at the Hermitage. He was a guy who worked for a peace group, and he watched Merton answer a letter, and he said, he said, typing with two fingers. He said it was so fast he thought the paper was going to catch on fire. And but when he came out, he pulled the thing out and it was like a full page letter to a 16-year-old who had written him and asked him what he thought about success, being successful. And basically he said, it's a mistake. But he wrote a whole page. He took a 16-year-old seriously enough to have part of his day doing that. When's the last time you actually wrote a letter to somebody? And when we get email, to answer them seriously, that takes time. But that, when I'm answering an email, especially from fellow pilgrims I've been walking with for years, decades in some cases, that's a connection with the sacred. Just like, when the UPS guy comes up, delivery of something. You talk to him. How are you doing? I talked to the guy last night. I said, well, things must be easing up, huh? You must be feeling better. He says, oh, hell no, doesn't ease up till tax day. I don't know why that is, but that's just the way it is. Doesn't ease up till, middle of April. Consumer culture. But at least, I said, well, hang in there, brother. So just any exchange, somebody at the checkout counter. No, human to human. But that's what we're talking about in terms of this making ready for the sacred. Okay, well, here's the new poem. And then it'll lead us to our sitting. It's called No Laughing Matter. It starts like this. Knock, knock. Who's there? God. Bullshit. And then this is from, it's sort of a poem in two parts. Knock, knock. Who's there? God. Bullshit. And then the second part is from Revelations, the last book in the Christian Bible. 3:20, if you want to look it up. 3:20. This is the voice coming out of the fire of that vision on the island of Patmos, talking about the sacred, speaking right directly to you. He says, here I stand at the door and knock. Knock, knock. If you hear me calling and open the door, I will come in and we will share a meal as friends. Beautiful. Think about the invitation of that. Here I stand at the door and knock. Knock, knock. Who's there? God. Bullshit. I mean, God's always knocking at the door. Might not be like, you want to sound like James Earl Jones or anything, but there's so many ways. God's right at the door. See, here I stand at the door and knock. If you hear me calling, and that's the key here, because we have to sort of tune the area of the heart to hear in so many other dimensions. But that knock is not like that. It's just Jesus is always at the door. God is always at the door. The Buddha is always at the door. See, and if you hear me calling, basically the life of contemplation is call and response, and the call is always there. It's the response that, that's our part. See, if you hear me calling and open the door, I will come in and we will share a meal as friends. There's something nourishing that comes from this whole thing. This is the nourishment that comes from living this, from doing all this, for showing up and learning how to listen. It's in the end, the image of a meal. I will come in and we will share a meal as friends. You can't have a relationship it's not this kind of relationship that, you're thinking of sending prayers up to heaven or whatever. That works for kids, but doesn't work for adults. And, so we have the divine saying, we'll come in and we'll sit down. We'll have a meal as friends. That's the payoff. And the meal is nourishing. The meal is nourishing. And well, think about, the big thing is, do you hear it? And then if you hear it, do you ignore it? Bullshit? Or do you open the door? Rumi said, One of my favorite Rumis where he says, I've sort of worked with it to make it my own. It said, oh, here in the hollow, the great hearted gather. We are a door that's never locked. If you're feeling any kind of pain, stay near this door. Open it. I called through your door. Hey, the poet walks the pilgrim road. Come on out. Leave me alone. I'm sick. I don't care if you're dead. Grace is here, and it wants to resurrect somebody. Jesus is here, and he's dying to resurrect you. Come out. Leave me alone. I'm sick. Yeah, that's one of the great ones. He says, I don't care if you're dead. Grace is here, wants to resurrect somebody. Jesus is here, and he's dying to resurrect you. Interesting subtlety with Rumi. There is this sense of there's a grace, like a force that wants to resurrect everybody, but then it gets real personal with a guy like Jesus, because he was the personification of this kind of, I don't know what else you could call it, is just this total compassion. And then he was very individual. He stopped for the people in the street, the blind man, the woman who touched his hem. And so there he says, Jesus is here and he's dying to resurrect you. So knock, knock. Who's there? So we'll go into this now. And we'll just sort of shift to our silent contemplation part.